everyone. Welcome to another virtual Science on a Sphere program at the MSU Museum. My name is Nick VanAcker, and I'm the Science on a Sphere coordinator at the museum. And I'm really excited for today's program. We're going to be talking all about fossils. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Earth, so we can get kind of a base layer for what we're talking about here. Then we'll talk about different ways fossils can form. We're going to highlight some fossils from Michigan. And then we're going to do an activity where we'll make our own fossils that you can also make at home out of a few ingredients you probably already have in your cupboard. So if you've tuned into an SOS virtual show before, you probably know that you can follow along at home with us by pulling up the data sets we're looking at on your own devices. Usually we do this on the SOS Explorer app, but this week we're going to be looking at a data set that actually isn't on the app. So we'll be using the Science on a Sphere website instead. On the website, you're able to find hundreds of data sets, hundreds more data sets than are on the app, including the one that we're looking at today, which is called PaleoMap. So to find this data set, you can go to the website and search for PaleoMap, which is P-A-L-E-O map, same as the beginning of paleontology. You can search for it in the search bar, or you can hit the land tab, which is the brown box with the mountains, and then scroll down to find the PaleoMap data set. So when you open the PaleoMap dataset, it's going to look something like this. It's going to look like the Earth as we know it. But in order to talk about fossils, we're going to need to do a little bit of time travel. And then luckily, it's really easy to do that using the PaleoMap dataset. So the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. And as far as we can tell, life has existed on Earth for around half of that time. We start seeing the first evidence of life occurring on Earth about 2.3 billion years ago. The PaleoMap dataset doesn't go back quite that far, but using it, we can travel back in time about 750 million years, which is still a really good distance into the past. For the first, when it first started appearing about 2.3 billion years ago, life was usually single-celled organisms. And if you're interested in those, you can learn more about them in our micro program from a couple of weeks ago. But up until about 750 million years ago, life stayed as single cells. But around that time, life started getting bigger and a little bit more interesting, a little bit more complex. So 750 million years ago is a good place to start. So as you can see, we're going to start with the Earth looking like it does today, and then we'll slowly move backwards in time. So as we start to move backwards in time, you're going to see that the continents haven't always been in the same places that we know them today. So as they start drifting, you can see that South America and Africa used to be part of the same landmass, and that their edges fit snugly together like pieces of a puzzle. And as we go even further back in time, you're going to see that North America fits snugly in there too, right into the top, and they form another landmass even further back in time. And so if you can, it's really great to pay attention to some of the lines that are on this map. You might notice that you can see kind of state borders and country borders that are on this map as we go further and further back in time. And that's a great way to keep track of modern land masses as we go back in time and look through the history of the Earth. Especially paying attention to Michigan, which is important for us being a museum from Michigan. It's really fun to watch Michigan move over the surface of the Earth. You'll notice that it does not stay in the same place. It starts off in the Northern Hemisphere, in our modern times. But as we go further back in time, you'll notice that it moves toward the equator, sometimes all the way down to the South Pole. Sometimes Michigan is covered in land, sometimes it's completely covered in water. And so the location of Michigan, and whether it's land or water, is going to affect the type of animals that could be living there during that time. If Michigan's completely covered in water, it's going to be aquatic animals. If it's covered in land, it's going to be animals that live on land. And so the type of animals and plants that were able to live in Michigan during these different time periods are also going to affect the type of fossils that we're able to find, because fossils are basically just dead animals and plants. So depending on what animals were alive during these time periods are going to affect what fossils we're able to find in modern Michigan. So as all those rocks continue to move and change throughout the Earth's history, as all the continents continue to drift around and bump into each other, the Earth is constantly changing. So new layers of rock were constantly being deposited on the very top layer of the Earth's surface. It helps, if it does help for you, you can kind of think of it like a bottle of sand art. You might have done sand art at a summer camp, or maybe just as an activity as a kid. You can see some pictures of the sand art over on the right-hand side. But as new layers of rock continue to be added to the surface of the Earth, the layer that used to be the surface is going to get deeper and deeper and deeper, along with everything else that was on the surface at that time. So thinking of it like sand art, maybe you put down a layer of pink sand all the way down at the bottom, and you could put some beads on top of it maybe. Right now, those beads are on the surface. But as you add more and more layers of sand, those beads are going to get slowly buried. Not because, they dug a hole and got themselves down there, but because new rock was being deposited on top of them. And so you could think maybe of those beads like a fossil, that if an animal was on the surface and died, slowly it's going to get buried. And so I have a really great illustration here that was drawn by an artist named Ray Troll, and it shows kind of how these layers work. So each layer of rock represents a different period of the Earth's history. You can see that the Earth's history starts all the way down at the bottom, where it says Earth forms 4.6 billion years ago. And as we go up, all these periods have different names, and you can see we get closer and closer to the present. Each layer of rock is going to represent a period of the Earth's history, but inside these rocks, you're also going to find the fossils of plants and animals that lived during that period. Now, you're never going to find a slice of Earth that looks this perfect, that has every single layer from the Earth's history, because even as rocks are being constantly deposited on the surface, rocks are also going to be eroded away. They could be eroded away by wind and water, they could be moved around by ice, maybe they're morphed or moved by heat, and sometimes they can even be shuffled out of order when the continents move around and run into each other. But scientists are able to use this information in charts like this to help them figure out when fossilized plants and animals would have been alive. They can look at them in relation to other plants and animals, or they can look at them in relation to what layer they find them on the Earth. And they're going to know not only when they would have been alive, but also maybe what their environment would have looked like. If we know where ancient Michigan was located when an animal was alive, we might be able to have some ideas about whether it was warm or cold, whether it was wet or dry, all sorts of different stuff. So you can kind of see another example of this when we look at this illustration. So there you can see a dinosaur dying up on the top left-hand side. And after the dinosaur died, it was slowly covered in layers of rock and eventually became fossilized. However, once the layers of rock started to erode away, people were finally able to discover that fossil. So the fossil was there the entire time, even as the rocks continued to shift and change, but without the fossil being on the surface of the land, people weren't able to see it. So usually when we're looking at something like this, like I said, we won't be able to see all the different layers of the Earth exposed all at the same time, but maybe there's a cliff somewhere that has a really good example of Triassic and Jurassic rock. Or maybe there's a hillside somewhere that's got really good Pliocene and Miocene rock that's kind of eroded away. And we'll be looking at this in more detail a little bit later. So now that we've talked about how scientists kind of know how to figure out how old fossils are, we can talk about what a fossil actually is. So a fossil is going to be any preserved remains, impressions, or traces of a once living thing from a past geological age. And this is a pretty simple definition, but we can break it down a little bit. When it says preserved, all it means is that a fossil isn't going to rot away, that a fossil has gone through some sort of process to be preserved. Remains, impressions, or traces, we'll talk about in a second, but it just means all sorts of different stuff can be preserved. Of any once living thing, so it has to be something that was alive, and from a past geological age just means that you're not going to have something die and become a fossil within 3 years. Fossils take a long time to form, and also fossils are going to be really old, no matter what the thing is. You won't have something die and a couple of years later find a fossil of it. You're going to have something die and find a fossil of it maybe 10,000 years later, 1,000,000 years later, 1,000,000,000 years later, stuff like that. So there are lots of different types of fossils, and when we say types of fossils, I don't necessarily mean there are dinosaur fossils and plant fossils, for instance, although that is true. What I'm talking about here is that fossils can form in a number of different ways, and so we'll talk about some of the different ways that fossils can form. So there's lots of different types of fossils, but one of the most common ones is a mold or impression fossil. So basically, to make a mold or impression fossil, first, an organism has to die. Unfortunately, that's the beginning of how all fossils form. So after the organism dies, it's going to leave an impression of itself, and then it will decay away. And so this usually happens in sand or silt or mud. And so if it helps, you can kind of think of this like using your hand on a sandy beach. If you press your hand into a sandy beach and remove it, you're going to be leaving a handprint in that sand. And so the impression left by your hand is similar to a mold or impression fossil. The difference is, of course, a mold or impression fossil is going to be formed when something rots away, and your hand isn't rotting away, you're just taking it out. But it is similar in that this is going to result in a reverse image of the organism. And for the fossil, the sand will harden around the object or the organism to turn into rock and leave this impression in the rock. So once you have a mold or impression fossil, it's a really good way to get a cast fossil too. This is one of the fossils that most people are familiar with. This is the way that dinosaurs' bones are usually preserved. So an organism will make a mold or impression fossil the same way that we just saw in the previous one, and it's going to make an organism-shaped hole. So say that we're talking about a dinosaur bone, for instance. A dinosaur will die, and its bone will make a mold or impression fossil in some sand, which makes a dinosaur bone-shaped hole. And then after the bone rots away, the bone-shaped hole is going to be filled in with minerals, which is going to make a bone-shaped rock. So the interesting thing about dinosaur bones is that usually they're not actually bones. They've all been replaced entirely with rock. So they're really just dinosaur bone-shaped rocks. And so you'll often see these mold impression fossils and these cast fossils together as kind of two halves of the same thing, because you need a mold or impression fossil in order to make a cast fossil. There are other ways that fossils can be preserved, of course, too. One is an imprint fossil. You can see this is a picture here of Archaeopteryx, which is kind of a transitional animal between dinosaurs and birds. But so an imprint fossil is going to be a two-dimensional image of a fossil. You'll see the leaves on this Archaeopteryx were preserved as imprint fossils. Plant leaves are usually preserved this way. And then you might also see something like skin impressions even. We have some really cool examples of what dinosaur skin looked like preserved through imprint fossils. One of the last ways that we can find fossils is through permineralization. And this is similar to the way a cast fossil works, but rather than waiting for something to rot away and then having minerals fill in, the minerals fill in at the same time as an organism is rotting away. This is also called petrification. So you might be familiar with like the petrified forest in Arizona, or maybe some other locations, but you can see these really, really great petrified organisms there. It happens a lot to plants, but bones and teeth can also be preserved this way. And the final way that fossils can be preserved are through trace fossils. So trace fossils is kind of a catch-all term for any type of fossil that is left behind by an organism. So a trace fossil isn't going to be an animal itself, but it's going to be something an animal or a plant left behind. So it could be something like the dinosaur footprints we see on the left. It could be something like a fossilized poop, which we see on the right, which is also called a coprolite, or it could even be something like an animal's burrow that they left behind. But trace fossils help us know all sorts of really great things about animal behavior and lets us know things that we wouldn't be able to know from fossilized skeletons, for instance. A fossilized skeleton might tell us that a dinosaur walked around on two legs, but looking at a dinosaur's tracks is going to tell us how fast a dinosaur could run. Same thing, looking at a dinosaur's teeth could tell us what a dinosaur ate, but looking at its fossilized poop could tell us more about how its digestive system worked. So looking at these fossils are a really fantastic way to learn all sorts of cool things about ancient life. So for our activity today, we're going to be making salt dough fossils. Salt dough fossils are really fun and also really easy to make, so people of all ages can enjoy it, kids and adults alike. And it's a really simple process to make them. So I have some pictures of some fossils that I made using this process. You can see there's lots of different cool things you can make, lots of different ways you can make them your own. They can be as simple as pressing a plastic dinosaur into the dough to make a Stegosaurus fossil. You can get a little bit fancier and create some bones, paint your fossils if you're interested. You can make individual fossils, the way that I did with a raptor claw and a shark tooth, or you could even create whole fossil scenes showing some of those trace fossils that we talked about with some footprints, some dinosaur eggs, and there's even a fossilized coprolite in that one. The process to make them is really simple. You only need 3 ingredients. You're going to need 2 cups of flour, 1 cup of salt, and 2/3 of a cup of water, which you probably already all have in your cupboard already. Those are the only 3 ingredients you really need. You could also use plastic dinosaurs if you want to make some of your fossils, or you could use different materials you can find outside, like leaves or pine cones. You can also use paint if you have it and if you're interested at the very last stage of making the fossils. The steps to make them, again, like I said, are super simple. Most of them kids could do. Some of them will require baking, so that's going to be something a parent would need to do. But the first step is going to be heating your oven to 200 degrees. After that, you just mix the dough together. This is a great step to get kids involved in. You mix the 3 ingredients together until it forms a dough. And then after you've made your dough, you're going to break it into 6 small pieces and form kind of pucks out of them, the same way that I made a puck for this stegosaurus. You can see just kind of a circular shape of a sugar cookie. And then after you make the pucks, it's just time to get creative and design your fossils. It could be something as simple as pushing a plastic dinosaur into the fossil to make this stegosaurus shape. You could also create sort of a scene. This one is actually made out of a Dimetrodon, which is not a dinosaur, but it's got a sail on the top of it. So we pushed the sail into the dough to make kind of a fun crack shape. You could also create kind of a little bit more detailed of a thing. I have a dinosaur figurine that's a skeleton, so we made a little skeleton fossil there. Or, like I said, you can create even a whole scene with footprints and creating a little dinosaur nest with eggs and a little fossilized coprolite. Or you can make fossils themselves. So I made a little raptor claw here. I just looked at pictures online and then was able to make the claw shape from there. And then I also made a shark tooth doing the same thing, just looking at pictures online and then forming my dough into that shape. So after you're done designing them, you're going to bake them in the oven until they're dry. And then once they are dry, you'll let them cool. Baking them should take anywhere between 1 and 4 hours. The pucks usually take about an hour to dry, but some of my thicker fossils, like my raptor claw, for instance, took about 3 hours to dry. So it just kind of depends. This is a really great activity to do after dinner. If the oven is still hot, you can just set it to 200 degrees, bake until you go to bed, and then turn off the oven before you fall asleep and let them sit kind of in the hot oven overnight. And then they'll be cool in the morning. So after they are cool, then it's going to be time to paint your fossils. You can use any sort of paint for this. It really doesn't matter. And again, this is another great time to get creative. You can layer all sorts of colors. Think about what sort of colors fossils might be. You can look at pictures online to see. I liked this one because it kind of looks like a little bit of a muddy trackway. That's really fun. One thing to note with the paint, though, is that these fossils work by baking and getting all the water out of the dough to make them dried out. And so if they get wet again, they're going to turn back into kind of mushy dough, and paint has water in it. So you'll want to be careful when you're painting your fossils to not get them too wet, but they can take a little bit. You can still continue to paint them, and they should be okay. You just want to keep an eye on how wet they're getting while you paint them. So that's the end of our program for today. I hope everyone had a fantastic time tuning in, learning all about fossils. I know I had a great time talking about it. We want to thank the Michigan State Federal Credit Union, again, sponsor of Science on a Sphere, along with everybody in the public who donated to make Science on a Sphere a possibility. And if you aren't already aware, you can actually donate to the museum and become kind of part of that crowd that helps support all of this programming that we do both here, all the virtual program that we're doing on our website, and also the programming that we do with schools and our community once we start being back in person at the museum. So if you are interested in donating, we'll have a link available for you to do so. But again, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.